Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Adam. Today's project is a Seiko chronograph from October of 1971, model 6138-0017. This watch belongs to a good friend of mine named Darren, who also happens to be a patron member. I've known him quite some time now. We met because we had common interests in a totally different area, and then we started talking about watches, and it's spiraled on from there. So he picked up this UFO. I have one of these as well, and he wanted one, so he found this thing on eBay, and now it is on my bench. And we're just taking a look at it here to see how this thing is functioning, if there's anything not working, if there's any issues that we can identify before we take it apart. I checked the rollover, and that seemed to work okay. And now we're checking the quick set for the day and the date. That's accomplished by pulling the crown out to the first position, the first outward position, and rotating the crown in either direction to change those things. One thing he did tell me, and I'm finding out here again, is that the chronograph will actually not stop running. Yeah, you cannot stop it on this watch. The buttons stick really hard, and even when you do press it in, just like you see here, the chronograph just keeps on ticking, regardless of what you do. So I knew that was a problem. He said that the watch seems to run, but he can't stop the chronograph. So on top of that, the watch appears to be original, but that crystal is just beat all to heck. And we'll show a better view of that later. But the watch, the case shows its age. And there's been one other watch on the channel owned by this same guy. And he likes to keep his watches, the cases untouched if they look, if they don't appear to be redone. So we're going to do that here. Time graph readings show this thing actually not keeping bad time at all. It's a bit slow. The beat error is not too terrible, but it could be better. The amplitude's really low. That just kind of signifies that this watch is due for a service. So we're going to go ahead and remove the case back just using the sticky ball here. It was kind of tight, but I was able to get it off with this without having to break out the big tool. And then when I first took it off, I was actually really surprised because this movement looks really clean. And, you kind of find that on eBay. Someone may say, yeah, I've worked on it or it's been serviced, but you never really know what you're going to get. And this is going to be one of those watches where we didn't know what we were getting into when we first opened this up. The first thing I noticed here is take a look at that operating lever. I'm going to go ahead and pull the spring off of this. That operating lever is broken. That should be attached to the bridge. And that is what, when you press in the start stop button on the chronograph, that's the lever that operates and engages with the column wheel. And it should be permanently attached to that plate via a stud that goes through there and mounts right where that arrow is pointing. And that is just gone. So that is 100% why, we couldn't get this chronograph to stop, is because it's completely broken. Just going to use my tweezers and a little bit of pressure here and pull those pushers back out to where they belong. And we can go ahead and remove the oscillating weight. This is held on just by one screw. I'll go ahead and take that out. I thought I was. Hang tight. There we go. And we can go ahead and pull this off. So yeah, as we dig into this movement, he had sent me the ad for the eBay posting on this, and the ad said, it was totally functioning. So keep that in mind as we get into this build later, because different people's definition of everything works can be I think of something different apparently than whatever that seller was thinking. But I was having a lot of difficulty pulling this movement ring out, and as it turns out, the tension ring for the crystal, or tension ring for the case back rather, was catching the inside of the case, and that indexing slot on there is not in the correct position. But I rotate it around that way it won't bind when I remove it, and we can pull this movement ring out. And taking a closer look at the pushers, you can see how that start-stop pusher there is just severely bent. But these are in there pretty hard, pretty gummed up. We can see that the gasket on the reset pusher is basically gone at that point. It's just like hard as a rock. And then there's the spring. So, they cleaned this watch, but they didn't clean everything on it. I mean, goodness. That one there took a lot of force to come out. Same case on this one. That pusher's severely bent. And if I remember right on this spring, Yeah, this spring did not want to come out at all. And I actually really consider those consumables. So we're going to put new springs in here, but take a look as we basically just use brute force to pull this thing out. Boom. You see that cloud of dirt kind of go up into the air. Goodness gracious. Yeah. So there's the two pushers. And those pushers with those little ridges on them they're not in all the different Seiko chronographs. I've got another set that we're going to go ahead and put on this watch. And they're a factory set from Seiko, so not aftermarket. So we're going to keep original parts in this thing as much as we can. That one there, the crown looks to be okay. The stem looks okay. The gasket's pretty gone. And yeah, look at all that gunk inside the crown tube there and inside that recess. It looks like they just scrubbed the outside of this watch basically and didn't really clean much of anything. So now we can go ahead and remove this thing from the case. It was a little hesitant to go because that operating lever spring is still kind of sticking out of the side of the movement. But go ahead and pop the stem back in, and then I'll move the hands around to a point where it makes it easier to remove them, and you kind of get all the seconds, hand, hour, and minute lined up pretty close, so we can pull those hands off. So we'll just cover this with plastic, and I'll just use my levers to go ahead and remove these hands. And it's worth noting, if you're going to be doing one of these watches, some of these Seiko chronographs, my experience isn't, is somewhat limited. I'm not a professional, but what I found, especially on these Seikos, is that center seconds chronograph hand can be very stubborn. And, they're pressure fit on there and they're keyed on the pinion. The pinion's kind of shaped like the letter D. So that kind of cuts its way into that tube and indexes into one spot, and they can be very stubborn to come off. So you kind of have to have a feel for it when you pull them off, because you definitely don't want to damage it. And that was an original hand where the colors faded to basically near white. And I 100% want to reuse that. So I was very careful, trying not to damage anything. But we got all the hands off, and we need to remove the dial next. And that dial is held in place by two dial feet screws that kind of pinch. When you screw it in, they squeeze on those dial feet. So we just loosen those to remove pressure off those dial feet, and we can lift the dial off, and the dial spacer comes off with it. So at this point, I'm taking a look at the back side of the dial, and you can see that code where it says 1.9, and that's referencing the last day. The first number is the last number of the year, and then 9 is the month. So this was 1971 September, and the 10 on the case back is October of 1971. So it's an original dial. Yeah, everything's correct. And look how good that thing looks. I mean, that's phenomenal. On my Seiko, mine's about a year and a half older than this one. And at some point in its life, it had gotten moisture ingress into it. So the loom is basically shot, but it's an old original proof dial. So I left it alone. But this dial here is just in fantastic shape. So starting disassembly of the dial side, we need to remove the day wheel. That's held on by that clip. So we just use some plastic and safely remove that clip, and then that thing can lift right off. Next up, we have a couple cover plates. This one here I'm taking off is called the date dial guard, and it just kind of covers some teeth on that date wheel. And then the other cover plate that also has the day jumper integrated into it is held on by 3 screws. So we're going to go ahead and get those removed as well. So I'm sure you probably saw the length of the video when you clicked on it. This one here's a pretty long video. And I did that for a couple reasons. One, we have, some repairs that we're going to do on this watch. Most of them have never been shown on this channel before. And on top of that, this is my friend's watch. And I wanted to do a really thorough video and show everything I could. And for the most part, I can think of like 2 things that I didn't kind of really get captured well on camera. I'll explain what happened, but they weren't in there. But just wanted to do a real thorough step-by-step for him. He has this watch in his hands now, and so this is going to be a long video. So I hope you're comfortable. This one here took a long time to put together, and so I hope he enjoys it. I hope you do as well. But got the rest of the calendar works disassembled, and now this plate here I'm removing is called the cover plate, and this plate separates the calendar works and all those parts from the key on the top of it to the underside of this plate is where the keyless works, and all the parts for the hour recording wheel for the chronograph are held. So this plate just separates all those. It's held on by 3 screws. And you kind of have to be careful if you're doing one of these. After you get these 3 screws off, you really want to try your best. And that screw there was really tight, by the way. You really have to try your best to lift it as straight up as possible, because there's 2 pivots, one for the hour recording wheel and then the minute recording wheel, come through this plate. So if you lift it off at an angle, you risk damaging those parts. So I tried to get it as straight up as I could, but that thing came off quite nice. There's a little bit of oil and gunk on the underside of that plate, but that's not bad. And so we can begin here by removing the hour wheel. There's the intermediate wheel for the calendar works. And that looks like the same wheel basically on the 6139 movements, just inverted. That's the hour wheel, and that thing was really stuck on there. Really, it was stuck on. That's the hour flyback lever spring, or the hour hammer spring. And that is the hour flyback lever. That's mounted on an eccentric pin, which is slightly out of adjustment. There's actually 4 eccentric pins on this watch that run different parts of the chronograph, and every single one of them was out of whack. I had to adjust every single one, which is not typical, because usually if they don't get messed with, you don't have to mess with them, but every single one of these was off. That is the hour hammer. So that comes off. And then this is the spring for the hour hammer brake. That other pin that it sits on, that's an eccentric pin as well. And so I'll kind of draw an arrow here that the head of the screw needs to be pointed directly at the center of the hour recording wheel from the factory. On the large side of that eccentric screw. Now, I've been known, sometimes I'll make them a little bit tighter, but that's the first thing I look at when I'm working on one of those, is see where that screw head is pointed, and make sure it's not 180 degrees off. But that one there is slightly off. So in the past, I found Rodico helps to remove that hour hammer brake lever, but it didn't really want to work, but I did lift it a little bit, so I got it with my tweezers there. And now we can begin disassembly of the keyless works. This first part I'm taking off here, held on by 1 screw, is the setting wheel lever guard. And it's just kind of got a cutout on that part that extends out where the setting lever complete kind of rotates back and forth for the quick set. This thing here was being a bit stubborn. Did not want to come off. There it goes. You see that little kind of cut in there where that thing rides. This next one is the setting wheel lever plate, held on by 1 screw, and that can be kind of finicky to get back in. That's a tiny little screw. We'll go ahead and get that part removed. And this is the setting wheel lever complete. And that kind of has all the gears permanently attached to it that operates that quick set, and also your time setting train is it's all on there. And now I'm just loosening these 2 screws on the setting lever spring, and just making sure that there's no stored tension in that spring, and then I can go ahead and safely remove this without fear of losing that part. On this particular movement, those 2 screws are the same size, so I don't worry too much about mixing those up. On several other movements, that's not always the case, and those screws may be a different size. But on this one here, they are. And I'm going to use some Rodico here to remove that yoke spring. There we go. And one thing I noticed when I had that, my Rodico also took up this part, and that is the smallest part with the longest name. That's the day-date corrector wheel rocking lever. I just call it the boomerang because it looks like a boomerang, so I may just reference it as boomerang later, but if I do, just know that's the part I'm talking about. Then the actual setting lever itself. Then now we can remove the stem, and I can drop it like I seem to do half the time. And I know I showed it once earlier, but there it is again. And now we can remove the winding clutch and the winding pinion rather, and the sliding clutch. And that's basically the keyless works. And then we can go ahead now and just remove our cannon pinion. And outside of, the capstones and whatnot, that's basically everything for the dial side of the watch. Okay, so we got the movement flipped over. And the first thing we want to do is remove the automatic works, because we can't unwind the mainspring with the automatic works in place. So the automatic works bridge is held on by 2 screws. I'm going to go ahead and get those two removed. And then you can watch me fumble around and make the same mistake I seem to make every other time I work on one of these things, where that pawl lever there's a little bit of tension on it, wrapped around that transmission wheel, and pop, there it goes. Every time it seems like I forget. And, that thing pops. It only goes about 2 inches on the desk. There's not enough tension to really go very far. But, I just kind of had to laugh at myself, because I just do that all the time. But there it is. And you can see some gunk kind of on that cover plate. And now we can remove the transmission wheel. And that's the wheel that interacts between the automatic works and the ratchet wheel. But now that that's out of the way, we can pull our click spring out of the way, like I'm doing with my tweezers. And I just let the screw driver on the ratchet wheel just kind of unwind very slowly in my hands, and just trying my best to safely remove power from the mainspring. There we go. And that actually took a lot longer. A little editing magic there to make it not be 30 seconds long. But with power removed, balance comes to a stop, and we can go ahead and safely remove it. This one is held on by 2 screws, as if it wasn't obvious from the video. But I'm just trying to be very careful and remove these without scratching anything or slipping, heaven forbid. And I'm just going to use my screwdriver here just to break any tension, any hold, where it just moves slightly, and now it'll be free to kind of pop up, and I can get my tweezers underneath it and safely remove that balance. I like to go ahead and place it on a cushion and just kind of take a look at it underneath the microscope and see if anything is blatantly wrong and staring me in the face. But all the coils seem to be concentric. No visible issues from here. It's really hard to check flatness of the hairspring when it's not in a watch or removed, but everything looks good right there. So now we can remove the chronograph bridge. This is held on by 3 screws, and there is a significant amount of tension on this plate because of the hammer click spring. So what I like to do is, before I remove the plate completely, I like to, right here, I'll just take this hammer click spring and move it to the other side of the hammer post. And then that'll kind of save us from, that thing coming off with a whole lot of energy. There's still technically tension because it's now sitting on the other side of the post, but it's significantly less. But now you saw that whole plate move. That's about all the movement that you get. So I like doing it that way. With those 3 screws removed, we can go ahead and safely pull this plate off. There we go. And it looks like the intermediate minute recording wheel decided to come off with it. So we'll separate those. And now we can pull off the minute recording wheel itself. I'm just taking a quick look at it underneath the microscope. And we'll do a very thorough inspection, after it gets disassembled and when we do pre-cleaning and all that. So, and that's where we find a whole lot of problems that aren't necessarily readily visible just through here. Right now, I'm just disassembling it. And any major thing, I'd see. But really where you find these problems here is during cleaning and inspection after the watch is disassembled. So that's the hammer spring. Now we can remove our hammer. Now we can remove the coupling levers. There's 2 screws holding the coupling levers down. This first one here just goes into the first coupling lever. And this screw here is a very special screw. It's only found in one spot on this watch. It's got a very unique shoulder on it that allows it to go down, but still allow movement for those coupling levers underneath it. But once that's out of the way, we can go ahead and remove these, and I make sure that they're pulled out away from the chronograph wheel, where they're not engaged with the clutch on the chronograph wheel, and they're free of it before I lift them upwards. Those are out of the way, and now we can remove our column wheel. And I think technically they call this, the manual may call this the pillar wheel. The pillars are the actual vertical posts on that column wheel, but I'm just going to call it a column wheel, but I'm removing the jumper spring out of the way, and then we can pull that column wheel off. And as you can see, like, this movement is not that dirty. It at first at first glance. Off. There goes that bushing, that bearing. Those things do like to go flying. So you got to be careful with those. Now we can remove our ratchet wheel. And kind of keep in mind that, this movement looks really good for an eBay movement, but you start looking underneath the parts, and we'll take off a plate later where you can definitely see that. But on the underside of this ratchet wheel, quite filthy. So yeah, it's just one of those things. Now we can remove the bridge. The bridge is held on by 3 screws, and I'm actually doing this a bit prematurely. I'm going to go and pull all 3 of these screws off, and try to come up with something witty and funny or something to say as I do this as the video goes on. But before I actually take that plate off, what I didn't catch is that there's a cover plate, over the third wheel and the escape wheel, rather. That there we go. And I finally caught that before I pulled the plate off. So now I'm going to remove this plate, and you can see there that one pops off too. But you can kind of see it from the picture here. We'll zoom in here in just a minute. But on the underside of that plate, there we go. You can see all that old oil and gunked up junk and all that. And like, when they cleaned this movement, or whoever did it, did not remove that plate, clearly. But now that that's off, we can go ahead and remove this bridge. I like to remove that because, you can't oil those pivots with that plate in. So, I mean, it needs to come off. There's permanently affixed intermediate winding gear on the underside of that. Here's the other intermediate winding gear for the manual winding of the watch. And the 2 sides on that are technically different, so I was just making note of which side faced upwards. And now just taking a look at the chronograph wheel. And this thing actually looks really good. The clutch spring is, everything's level and even. Just kind of doing a real close inspection on it, making sure it looked good and everything looked fantastic. So now we can do the third wheel. And again, I'm just kind of looking at it underneath the microscope. It doesn't really catch it too well on camera here. I'm just doing a quick inspection to see if anything's just terribly, if a pivot was bent or something, I would see it. I zoom in a lot closer during pre-cleaning and inspection to, check the status of the pivots, how dirty they are, if there's any scratching on them, stuff like that, which you got to be in way closer than that shot was. So that's just a very initial check. Now we can carefully remove this pallet fork, and that pallet fork is stuck in its bridge, which is not ideal, obviously, but we'll go ahead and pull that out of there. And as it turns out, whoever put this watch together last put a massive amount of oil in there, which you definitely don't want. But that there is the escape wheel. Some of the pivots on these do look a little bit filthy. Some of the pinions on these wheels also do not look all that great. But and take a look. I'm going to go ahead and check the end shake on the center wheel while I have it in there. I know it's filthy right now, but I just wanted to see what it felt like, and I'll check it again during assembly. But it's just easy to get to at this point, and I just wanted to see what it felt like before we took it apart. So the center wheel bridge is held on by 1 screw. And this screw here, you can tell the difference. This screw and the screws for the pallet fork bridge are very close. But if you put your screws together, you'll note that that screw there does not have a polished head on it. And the ones for the pallet fork bridge will. So you can tell them apart in that manner as well. Sometimes the heads on them will be flatter on the pallet fork than that wheel. But technically speaking, we should be able to get the barrel out without removing the click spring. I end up removing it later before we reinstall it. Just because it's easier. But now the center wheel can come out. There's a lot of gunk on that jewel, but as I'm taking a look at the center wheel, look at that pivot or that pinion on there, and look how gummed up and terrible that is. And when I saw that, my first thought was, I actually went and checked the barrel as well. And sure enough, on that barrel, in between those teeth, really hard to see on this camera, but very filthy between a lot of those teeth. But I'm checking in shake between the barrel and the arbor, and there is the slightest bit of movement, which is what you want. So that didn't look bad. But the teeth definitely are just full of gummed up all kinds of nonsense. And that's kind of what I'm doing underneath the microscope right here, is just eyeballing it really closely and just seeing what it is. And I'm kind of trying to check for, bent teeth or misshapen teeth as well. So after I've satisfied my curiosity, inspecting it for a little bit, it's time to go ahead and remove the mainspring from this barrel. So I'll just use my tweezers here as a hard surface and press down on the bottom side of the barrel. It puts force against the arbor and then makes the top pop off. Then I'll just kind of wedge my brass tweezers here and just very slowly work them in as I rotate the barrel around and just begin to work up that barrel lid, doing my very best to be very gentle with it. I do not want to kink that barrel or bend it in any way. So just very slowly, very carefully, just doing that until I can separate the two. And I'll just grab another set of tweezers here and just gently remove it. And taking a look inside this barrel, that's Seiko's S4 grease, so it looks filthy, but there is a lot of wear on that barrel lid, and there's a lot of wear on the bottom side of that barrel housing. So when I take the spring out. So it's the spring here is not in the best of shape. Go ahead and remove this arbor real quick so you can kind of see that. That wasn't a half bad shot, to be honest. But taking a look at the arbor, it's just covered in grease, old, dirty, grimy grease with dirt in it and gunk in it, and it's almost acting as a grinding paste more than a lubricant at this point. But all those points with the arrow where grease is built up and is not doing us any favors at this point. Now I can remove the mainspring from the barrel, and this is how I like to do it. I'll bring those inner coils up and just barely get my tweezers underneath it. And then I can begin to work it around, just keeping my tweezers underneath the spring. And I'll unwind it. I don't know, 5, 6, 7 coils, something that in that area where now there's enough room for me to get my fingers underneath it. But right about to that point right there. And then I'll just unwind it the rest of the way. I won't show the whole thing, but I unwind it in this manner very slowly and just work it out until I finally reach the end. And just being careful not to let it fly out when it hits the bridle. But there's our mainspring. And so one of the things I've discussed previously, even though I'm gonna use a new mainspring on this watch, I've talked about kind of flattening hairsprings or mainsprings in the past. And yeah, take a look how filthy that is. That's gosh. But some people have asked me, well, how are you doing that? So I'm going to show you here in one shot real quick, even though this is filthy and that's not the point of this. The bridle side of the mainspring is on the right-hand side. And you can see how that's about twice as thick as the mainspring on the left. And so that's kind of what's different about Seiko mainsprings. The replacements, although they do work fine, don't have that difference in thickness between those two pieces. So this old mainspring, you can see here, there's a high point right there. And over here on the inner part of that, there's a pretty significant high point there. Some folks have asked me in the past, how I'm flattening those, because I mentioned that I'm doing it, but I never really showed it. And this is basically it. I mean, it's not ideal, but sometimes I didn't really have any other option. So I'm finding the point where the bend really begins, keeping that stationary in one hand, and then trying to find a good angle here to show you on camera, but just very gently, very, very gently working that mainspring in very small increments. And then just working it back and forth until I get it to the flatness that I want. So I work that one for just a couple minutes. And as you can see here, the middle part of that high spot's basically gone. And I did that to the other side as well, but that's just how I do it. And I thought this shot here kind of showed it. If I can angle this where it meets the camera, you can kind of see where it's not really bent to one side anymore. It's pretty much even and flat. And so that's a kind of a trick I like to do, really just, under my own optics when I'm doing it. It's a really easy way also just checking where that high spot is. But that's how I flatten mainsprings. So I'm checking pre-inspection here, shining a flashlight underneath the movement. And that flashlight's a handy trick to see if you want to find cracks or damage to the jewels. If you turn the flashlight off, you can kind of see the top of the jewel and how filthy it is. But when you shine the light, you can kind of see through it. And if there's cracks and chips and all that, it becomes really apparent. So under pre-cleaning as well, checking this pallet fork, you can see this ridge in there where you can see where the escape wheel makes contact with it. And as dirty and filthy as that pallet jewel is, you can only imagine the escape wheel teeth are really not much better. But here's how I'm removing kind of the main part of the dirt from the center wheel pinion. Once I work my way around and do all that with that fiberglass brush, I'll come back with basically a toothpick and some Brasso, and I'll repolish all those leaves and try to get that working brand new. During pre-inspection here, we found that the transmission wheel jewel in the chronograph bridge was chipped. Pretty apparent when you see it there, and you can see how much that flashlight really helps. So doing this repair, we need to go ahead and push this jewel out and put a new jewel in its place. So we bring out the jeweling tool using the appropriate size stump and pusher. And that pusher's slightly smaller than the inside diameter of the hole in the plate so that it can go all the way through. And I'll just go ahead and simply press that jewel out. These aren't too terribly complicated. You always have to, check in shake when you're done, just to make sure, because if you have to raise or lower that jewel to adjust the in shake, that's what you need. But with the magic of editing, our new jewel's there, and we're going to go ahead and press this down with a larger stump that's larger than the diameter of that hole, because my goal is to get these flush with the underside of the plate as a starting point. And generally speaking, most of the time, at least on these old Seikos, that's pretty much the sweet spot. You may need to adjust it slightly here or there, but you're in pretty good shape if you make that your first spot you go to. But now you can see that replacement jewel looking all nice. And so we move on, and I noticed here on the chronograph bridge, the wheel for the chronograph wheel, the center wheel, or fourth wheel, the center seconds wheel, this is from the underside of the bridge, and as you can see, it looks like it's pushed out too far. You can see a gap between the edge of the jewel and the top side of that. And on the other side of that deal, you can see how high this jewel sits above that plate. That's going to cause that wheel to have way too much in shake. And so, although that jewel's not damaged, it is kind of out of adjustment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm readjusting it here, and I pushed it back in deep, and now I'm going to push it back out from the back side to get it flush with the back side of this plate. So I pushed it through the other side too far, and I'm coming back and setting it where I want it to be. And again, I want this thing to be flush with the back side of that. So it's kind of taking a look at it through the microscope. You can see kind of where that jewel, now it's pretty flush with the back side of that plate. Next thing I noticed here is on the minute recording wheel, the heart and the wheel are kind of separating from that stump there. There's that gap on one side, and I did not like that. And in the past, I've had one of these actually separate in the cleaning basket before, but I've heard of these things coming apart. So I'm restaking this wheel, and it looks like it's moving around a lot, but that thing went back together. Very light taps, by the way, when you do these, extremely light. But now you can see when we get it back out of there, that thing is nice and flush and everything looks great. That's what we're looking for. Same thing on the hour recording wheel. You can see that gap there between the heart and the wheel itself. And I did not like that either. So I did the same thing, inverted this just by the way, the shape of my stake and all that. And I'm going to go ahead and restake this thing, press it all the way down and stake it back into place. I set it back down there, and everything looked good on that one when we were done as well. So now the next repair is we need to fix this operating lever, because this thing should be permanently attached. And I do a poor job on the first attempt of it, but I'm going to keep that in the video to show you what not to do. And then I do it properly. So that there's a pin, and that pin gets pressed in to that plate, and it's got a shoulder on it. And so that we need to get that thing in there and press that pin into the plate to get this thing set right. And then actually peen it from the underside later. I'll show you a diagram of that. But first off, I had it on this stump, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pop this thing in, and you can see immediately that whole bridge moved at an angle. And so I knew immediately right then that stud was not in there straight. And you can kind of see it there. It looks like it's tilted to the left. And so I pulled it back off, put it in again, press it down before I got to the staking set. It's about as far as I could go. And now I've finally got smart and realized there's a much easier way to put the plate on there. I don't need that bottom stump. And now I'm seating that thing down fully, making sure it's all the way there. And what I didn't show on camera is I peened it from the backside. as well, but I'm going to put up a little graphic there. That's from the manual. It kind of explains how to do that, but you kind of get the idea. So I took a conical shaped punch and then expanded the bottom side out where it's reluctant to come apart again. So that's looking like it should, and you can see how flat that thing is now. So now we got that operating lever fixed. And we also need to do a jewel upgrade on this watch. So one more time, back to the jeweling tool. And we'll go ahead and push this old bushing out. It was pretty worn, but you've seen this part before. We've shown this on the channel. This top bushing here for this bridge is just simply push the old one out, push the bushing out, push the new one in, and just get it flush with the backside of that plate as a starting point. I would like to take this opportunity while you see me do this, since I've shown it before, just to say a very quick thank you to my patrons. It's your support that really helps this channel go. It really helps with sourcing parts and tools and all that. I'd like to say thank you to Ben, our newest member. Your support means a lot. Thanks so much. If you're interested in taking a look, a link can be found in the description and on screen. So thanks again. But now you saw all the parts there laid out. There's a ton of them. All the screws are stored separately. I keep them all organized so I don't miss anything. But now I'm going to go ahead and start putting all these parts in the cleaning baskets. I like to put a few of the delicate items, a couple of the parts for the gear train, the pallet fork and whatnot in that small basket. And then everything else sorted out by kind of component makes it easier for me to reorganize it after cleaning. And I'm going to put those pushers and springs to the side because we're not going to reuse those. But now we got that all done and out of the way, we can go over to our cleaning machine. This one here is an Elma manual machine. There's one wash cycle and 3 rinse cycles, and then a drying cycle once all that's complete. So we'll let that go. And while that's cleaning, I'm going to go ahead and start in on taking a look at this case. So we need to remove the bezel first thing. So I just used my case knife with some plastic in between that and the bezel. And there's a notch cut into that where that fits in, and we can go ahead and pop that off. And then once I heard the pop come off, we go ahead and separate it out. So taking a look here at the back side of this bezel, there's a good amount of built up crud and junk. And although the term isn't technically, appealing, wrist cheese, but it's kind of what it is. But you saw how clean, all the visible parts of the movement were in the case was. But, behind all this, clearly it was not that clean. So now we need to remove the crystal gasket. So this is a Viton gasket, original gasket. And what's great about these Vitons, this gasket, I guess, is 52 years old recently. And take a look how nice and malleable that gasket is. Completely reusable, as long as they're not damaged, physically damaged. They don't really break down like the older ones do, but they weren't very cost effective. Just the typical gaskets are a lot cheaper to make, so they quit making those. But there's some aftermarket sellers who sell a lot of that stuff. I think Spencer Klein, which I love his channel. I wish I had a tenth of his knowledge, but he sells some high quality parts on his website that I found. He doesn't know I'm mentioning his channel. He doesn't know me from anybody, but the chrono pushers and all that stuff. He gets Viton style ones made. So, those gaskets last you decades. So, but yeah, take a look at all this gunk on this case. I could make like one of those ASMR type videos or something just by cleaning this case. It's disgusting, but, and you just sit there and I could turn off all the sound and just put the video from me scraping that case with pegwood, and it'd probably get 1 million views or something. But, but it's just kind of ridiculous. But yeah, thanks, Darren, for giving me a watch covered in wrist cheese. But I worked my way around this case and the bezel and getting all that cleaned up. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this gasket off the case back. And what I noticed here when I pull this gasket off is it's the wrong gasket. First off, somebody had changed it. This gasket's not old. It's very malleable still, but that's a round gasket, and that is not correct for that watch. And take a look at this crystal. I don't know, folks. You tell me, but I'm going to go ahead and take a guess that crystal is not reusable. So all that got cleaned and put into the ultrasonic a few times with my cleaning solution, and parts came out. And now we're going to go ahead and get the balance jewels cleaned and lubricated. I'm just going to show you this one here. The other, we're going to put this top jewel in, but as far as oiling it and all that goes, it'll be the same thing for the other side. I'll show you the installation of it here, but We go ahead and drop that in, and I'm just going to shaky hands, really shaky hands, actually. Yeah. Go ahead and put this spring back in place. And this one here gave me a little bit of a fit. It was being stubborn, and I was being stubborn and hadn't eaten food yet, so I was shaking a little bit. But we finally got it in. We came to an agreement, and it decided to go in. So now we're going to go ahead and just do the same thing with the jewel on the backside. And on this one, it's complete opposite. After you see my shaky hands put the spring on, that's the beauty of macro shots. From far away, it looks like it's all smooth. You put it up close and it looks like a train wreck. But I put this one in, and this one went in absolutely beautifully. You would think I'd done this before, because it just all went in. And I got all kind of slick and decided to go in a different direction here, but boom. The first one did not agree with me that much, but that second one was all right. So I'm taking a look at the hairspring and just making sure that it looks flat. And when it does, it looks fantastic. Checking the impulse jewel on the bottom side of the roller table to make sure it's in line with the pallet fork and escape wheel jewels in the main plate. That looks pretty close. And one thing I haven't shown here, I'm just showing the interaction between the regulator pins and the mainspring and making sure it's breathing in between the two and not resting solely on one side. And all that's looking great. So I'll go ahead and pull that off and put that balance aside. We'll go ahead and put the mainspring barrel together. So this is Seiko's S4 grease, which is going to act as a braking grease for this. And that allows that spring to slip a little bit. It's kind of a spread. They make formulated, dedicated braking greases. Seiko's S4 grease, they tell you to put that in half the stuff on the watch, but it's a great braking grease too. And then I'll go back through and kind of what I like to do now is flatten those little blobs of grease. So when I put the mainspring in, it doesn't grab it. So here's our replacement mainspring. And putting this in, the hole in the washer, I mean, it's just barely smaller than the inside diameter of that barrel. So I'm pushing that in. That outwardmost coil of that spring is still stuck up. So I'm just kind of showing this, and I'm trying to get my tweezers on that very outside coil and push that down, because if I pull the washer out right now, that whole spring's going to come out flying. So I'm stuck here until I get it. So I'm just using my tweezers, trying to catch the tip of that, and there we go. You saw that spring finally kind of drop in there, and that outside coil find its spot. Now we can go ahead and remove that washer, and we have a new mainspring. Those come pre-lubricated, by the way, so you see some spots and stuff on there. That's that lubrication that comes on those from the factory. I'm applying a little bit of 1300 on the inside of that barrel wall. One thing I didn't know, the camera battery died, which is not the first time that's going to happen in the video. So it died kind of 30% into the process of putting the arbor in, but we just kind of fast forward there and you saw the arbor in, and now we're going to put the plate on, or the top lid on. So we'll just put it on this little tool and just take that cap and push it down. And it kind of this one here gave a very affirmative click when it popped into place. They don't always do that, but this one did. And after the click, I just kind of gave it one more for good measure. And now we need to lubricate a few points on the backside of this arbor. That gear that you see on that arbor is what drives the hour recording wheel for the chronograph. And has a clutch. So I put a little dab in there for that. And then 2 bits of HP 1300 on the top 2, steps of that arbor there. Now we can begin assembly of the watch. So we'll start with our center wheel, all cleaned up, and a little dab of oil. My hands are all over the place, and my microscope was out of adjustment, so we're stuck with that shot. But we got that in. Now we can put our center wheel bridge in. That just held in by one screw. And I'm going to go ahead and check in shake since this is final assembly. And that's looking pretty darn good. No issues there. I'm happy with that. And I always harp on in-shake a lot. And sometimes other channels mention it. One guy I used to watch, he hadn't uploaded a video in a while, but he was just a phenomenally good watchmaker. I learned more from just listening to him talk because the quality of his videos wasn't that great. It's like he had an iPhone or something 6 feet away. He'd shine it down. You really couldn't tell what he was doing, but as he talked through it and he would talk about what he was doing, I learned an awful lot just from listening to him. But he would check in shake and, mention it 10 times during a video. And, you don't hear about that a lot, but it is vitally important to make sure that that's good, or your watch is just not going to run right or not run to its potential. So It's one thing I'm very diligent about, whether or not it makes it on camera or something I don't talk about. But on every watch it, I'm checking and during disassembly and reassembly and adjustment. But one more time, right at the end after I tighten that final screw, just because that's the last time, just making sure that that's all good. So we got the stem greased, by the way, as I was talking about in shake, and I'm gonna go ahead and tilt it up to the side here, and it makes it easier to put on the winding pinion and the sliding clutch. So put a little bit of grease there on the winding pinion, and we'll just kind of hold the stem here and pop that into place. Now I kind of got lucky there. That was, that looked pretty smooth, but it doesn't always go that simply. You may take a time or two to get it on there. And then the sliding pinion. I went 2 for 2 there. That's actually pretty nice. But once those are on, then you can kind of tilt the stem forward and put it in. Like if you assemble the back side of the watch first, you don't have to do it this way. But since right now those parts would just fall through right now because there's nothing on the back side of that main plate, that's how we do it. And I'm putting some grease on the inside walls of that sliding clutch. So that's where the yoke is going to go. The yoke is actually going to make contact with the side walls and not necessarily with the bottom of that cutout. So now we got our setting lever in. And it didn't really feel like it went in all the way and it's engaging with some, there we go. Just adjusting it just a hair and now I can see that it's engaged with the stem. So now we can put on our boomerang, get that into place. There we go. And I'm putting a little bit more grease here on the setting lever where the yoke is going to make contact with it. Won't be the last time I do it, but speaking of the yoke, there that goes. Making sure that it's in there in that sliding clutch, and then I'm just checking where it engages with the setting lever. And I want to put one more dab here, kind of on that little side there. And there'll be excess grease on here. I'll go back later and then kind of clean up the excess. But now we can put on our yoke spring. So we put one little dab of grease on the yoke where that spring is going to connect with it. And I'm just going to use my hold down tool to set it up against the boomerang and the yoke. And it won't live against the boomerang. It's actually going to live against the setting lever complete, but you'll see me kind of set that into place here in a bit. And now we can put on our setting lever spring. And it's like I forgot how to do it or something. I kind of indexed it incorrectly, but I messed with it here for a second. And there we go. Drops into place. I'll just put the 2 screws in. I won't tighten them down fully. Just close to being all the way down, but not quite. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of lubrication on that setting lever spring itself where it's going to index with the setting lever. And that's just going to make it much easier to pull the stem in and out, especially at first, because since there'll already be grease in those spots, it won't be going into it dry. But we'll kind of get that put into place, and then I'll pull that spring back and set that into place. And I'll go back later, and again, we'll clean up all that excess grease. Just like that. I'm going to leave those 2 screws on the setting lever spring a hair loose right now because it's easier to get the setting lever complete into place when you have a little bit of play in there. So I will go tighten those before we're all said and done though, but there we go. All that grease seems to be gone. There's just a light film on that setting lever spring and all that where it belongs. So there's a couple lubrication points. This is the setting lever complete. So there's a couple lubrication points we need to hit on this thing before it goes in. I'm just using 9010 right here. 9010 is kind of the lightest, thinnest lubrication. So I'm going to use some brass tweezers and pull the side of that yoke spring up just like that. And I'm going to keep that held there. And now we can install our setting lever complete into place. And that spring is going to, when I release it, it's going to kind of release onto that little nub. But the other side of that setting lever spring, right there at the top, right now it's sitting on top of the setting lever. It needs to sit right there where that arrow is. It needs to sit to the left of it, basically to the side of it. So I'm going to pull the crown out, bringing that setting lever in, and now that's sitting where it needs to be. Just like that. And now with that done, I can go ahead and tighten down the screws fully on there. And then there's just a spot where that setting lever complete is going to engage with that setting lever. And so I'm just putting a dab of grease there. And then there's this little cover plate, which, to be completely honest, I make it look easy because boom, right there, I'm screwing that in. Sometimes that screw can be a nightmare to kind of get lined up and in there because as soon as you put your screwdriver on it, it wants to move on you. So especially early on, I would fight with that spring. That and the click spring can be temperamental sometimes. But we got that on, and now we can put this last plate in. That indexes right there on the one hole. It's got a cutout for a jewel, so I can oil through it, and then we'll go ahead and tighten this one screw on, and there we go. There's our keyless works. And I noticed there was a little bit of something there on that screw head, so I cleaned that up. Now we're putting some oil down here for the minute wheel, and then a tiny little dab on the raceway. A little bit of grease on our center wheel post where our cannon pinion is going to mount to. And then we're going to put some HP 1300 here for the intermediate wheel on the calendar works. So the cannon pinion mounts on, and that's friction fit. Most of the time they'll give you a click. Sometimes they won't, but that is on there. There's our intermediate wheel. And on the 6139 movements, like the Pogue, it's the same wheel on that, but it's just inverted where that smaller pinion's actually on the underside. There's our minute wheel, and that one went on nice and smooth. If you remember when we pulled that off, it was really kind of stuck on there. We're going to put a little HP 1300 on the cannon pinion, and now we can put on our hour wheel. And as we put it on, I'm just making sure that the teeth of that hour wheel are interconnected with the small pinion on the minute wheel and the intermediate calendar wheel. So just kind of giving those a spin to make sure that's all good. And now we can just kind of give all this a test. So just kind of rotate this crown at first, pull it out to the first position, which is the quick set, move it back and forth, and all that seems to be running okay. Very free movement of the quick set wheel, which is what you're looking for. And back in time setting mode, all that is interconnecting. You see that center wheel behind the movement kind of turning. So that's looking great. So now we need to adjust this eccentric pin for the hour hammer, or our recording wheel hammer. The green arrow is where that screw head's pointing, and the red arrow is, and the green arrow is where it needs to point. It needs to point to the pusher. So over here on the brake for the hour recording wheel, the red arrow is where that screw head is pointing. The green arrow needs to point directly at the center of that hour recording wheel. And you have to make sure that the larger size of that eccentric pin screw head is facing that and not away from it. And both of those were, so they were just slightly out of adjustment. These can be very difficult to turn. But because, I think they look like screws. And so someone maybe not knowing would go in there and start turning it and realize, oh man, this thing, it feels like it's cross-threaded or something, but they're eccentric pins. So we got those adjusted, and now I'm just oiling a few points where all these hour recording wheel chronograph parts are going to mount to. So we'll touch base on all those. So to start off, that is the brake. And that's what keeps, if you have the watch running, but the chronograph not running, that's what keeps that hour recording wheel from moving. And that's the intermediate stopping lever or brake lever. And that interacts with the second, that long post that goes through the movement is what interacts with the second coupling lever on the other side. So when you hit the chronograph button, that coupling lever pushes on that lever, which pushes on the brake and moves the brake out of the way. That there is a tension spring. Put a little bit of grease in there. Hold that spring down, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull that spring back and put it against the stopping lever and the intermediate lever, just like that. Move that brake back, and there we go. Next up, I need to put a little bit of grease on that intermediate lever, because that's where the hammer is actually going to ride in that channel. And truth be told, that's quite a lot of grease. I am going to clean up some of it. There's a nub on the bottom side of that hammer and rides in that channel. So it's a very, very high friction point. But I'm just going to use some Rodico and clean some of that up a little bit. Now we can put on our hammer itself. And that post it rides on has got a notch on that post. That's where the flyback lever spring is going to go. And you got to get that hammer past that little notch. Right now it's kind of stuck in there. So I'll move this thing around, and whilst doing that, getting that post on the intermediate braking lever on the other, or stopping lever on the other side. So now you can see that went past that little nudge on that post. So that's all the way down. And then I set that thing on the other side, just to make sure that nub on the bottom side of that is engaged with that correctly. That's our flyback lever itself. So when you press the pusher, this is the part that pusher actually engages with. So that's the eccentric pin that we first adjusted on that one side. And then the other side of that arm is going to attach to that hammer itself. And that's what's going to push the hammer over and operate that entire mechanism. So I'm putting a little bit of lubrication in there between those 2 points. And now we can put the spring in that kind of holds all this together. So I get the side on that eccentric pin first, on the bottom side, top side of there, around the top side of that, and then kind of hold it down with a hold down tool and bring it around to the other side of that notch on the hammer. And it seems like a couple of the other 6138s I've had on this channel, I've always seemed to get this out of I do a poor job of recording it or something, or I do a still shot afterwards to say, hey, here it is in place, but I never showed a clear shot of that spring going in, but I finally did on this video. So I put a little bit of lubrication on the bottom side of that hour recording wheel itself, and now we put that into place. And some 90-10 on the striking face of the hammer where it's going to engage with that wheel. You could also, instead of doing that, lubricate the heart on that wheel, but either way is fine. So we got the plate on, making sure we didn't damage any pivots doing it in, got it seated all the way down. And I'm just tightening those 3 screws. And now we can do a test to see if everything's functioning like it should. Actually, I'm going to lubricate the other pivot of that hour recording wheel real quick. Now I can do a test. And so that there is when you push it in, that's that running, and that all looks like it's free. So I'm going to rotate that hour recording wheel a little bit. Keep your eye on that wheel as we push down at the bottom. See how that wheel kind of resets. That hammer is going to hit that cam that I'm actually touching, and then it's going to fly back to so that's its home position. That's where that hand is going to face directly up, is when it's in that spot. So that brake on the left, you can see when we push the chronograph, the reset in, or when the chronograph is running. Either case, whenever that wheel should be moving, that brake's going to step away from that wheel. But when you stop the chronograph, you can see where that brake would go up and touch that wheel. And that's what's going to keep it from rotating. And that's also why there's a cam on the bottom side of that barrel arbor that drives that wheel. So if the brake's on, it's going to slip inside the air. There's a clutch, and it's going to slip inside that clutch, so it won't damage anything. But that's how that works. So we remove the click spring just to be able to put the barrel in easily. You could leave that click spring on if you assemble the dial side first. It's less of a hassle fitting the barrel in. But here I just opted to remove it real quick. Now we can put in our escape wheel and just kind of fiddle with it a little bit until it finds its jewel hole. Boom, there we go. Now the third wheel, and this is payback right here. Boom, right there, right immediately in its spot. I've never had a third wheel go in that easy. Thank goodness. So we apply some 90-10 to the post there on the chronograph wheel. Drop that into place. And add a little bit of lubrication here for the intermediate winding wheel. Go ahead and drop that into place as well. And then I'll just rotate it around a little bit just to make sure there we go. Now it's all the way down. So we can put on our bridge. One thing I did not put in video, that permanently affixed secondary intermediate winding wheel that's on the underside of that bridge, that does need to be lubricated, and it was. I just wasn't thinking. It's just one of those things where you forget you're filming. And so before I was off camera, I just oiled it real quick before I put it on, but that did get done here. But right now you can see that bridge is not set down fully. The escape wheel is not in its top jewel hole. So I'm going to see if we can get lucky here, and I'll do the tapping technique. See if we can get that bridge to seat down all the way. And that just kind of lightly vibrates everything. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But change angles here, and you can see we'll just give it a quick test, and all those gears turn. So that's good. So now we can go ahead and get this thing tightened down. 3 screws. I'll just get them all the way down at first. I'll test it again just to ensure that nothing was out of whack. And so still working good. Now we can just go ahead and tighten them properly. Just like that. Next up, I'm going to check the in-shake on the barrel again. And I did this once, but since this is final assembly, there we go. And there's just a very slight amount. I'm liking what I'm seeing there. So, and I actually didn't have to adjust that jewel after we did it. Having it flush with the bottom side of that barrel seemed to do the trick. I'm just checking in-shake on a few more things here. Obviously not the chronograph wheel because our bridge isn't on yet. But the third wheel, the escape wheel, all that stuff, making sure all that's good. So now we can put our click spring back on. So get that in one place and put our screw down here. I find it easier to do that and then have the spring not in its final place, I'll move that spring back over and then just give that thing a little nudge. There we go. So we're going to lubricate our wheel train as much as we can at this point. So applying some HP 1300 to the top barrel arbor jewel and just cleaning up a little bit. Every time I oil one that's in a pivot like that, it's you'll get a little bit of excess oil on the jewel itself. So just cleaning that up. That there is the third wheel. And that is our escape wheel. Trying my best to, not put too much oil in those. Just something I've had on my mind recently after a professional watchmaker actually gave me a bit of advice and said I was using just a bit too much oil sometimes. So I'm trying my best to be a bit more careful about that too. And you can see here. So this is the barrel on the back side or the dial side of the watch. So you can see that tiny little dab of oil there. It's kind of, you always get that, but I'll just wipe that off with some Ronico. You can see our nice clean bridge now that doesn't have all that oil on there. And we got our pivots lubricated. So now we can put on this cover plate. And that cover plate actually is basically the bottom bearing or bushing for the intermediate minute recording wheel. And that's where it's going to ride in that pivot or in that hole. That here's a little bit at 1300 for the column wheel. And it's almost out of oil in my deal there. So yeah, we get a little mark there on the raceway and we got the center stud lubricated and we can put our bushing back on. Make sure it's pressed down fully. And then once that gets down there, we'll just put one more slight dab of HP 1300 on the outside of that before we put our column wheel on, just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and use brass tweezers, pull that jumper out of the way and give us a little bit of room. Start to put our column wheel back in, and there's a few things kind of in the way. I need to move that operating lever out of the way. There we go. And the flyback lever, intermediate flyback lever is kind of barely in the way too, but I mess with it a little bit, and then once it gets all the way down, release the jumper, and we can screw that thing down. So now there is a couple of places we need to lubricate. There's actually more than a couple. There's a lot. So the first thing I'm going to do is lubricate where this jumper is by pulling it back, putting some grease in there. And so on this column wheel, and also on the operating lever, the striking face of that operating lever. And so this column wheel, the back sides of the columns, between the columns, and then a couple places on those teeth at the very bottom, the horizontal teeth, and on that intermediate operating lever, all those engage with there on those different points. So I'm lubricating about every third point on each of those points between the columns, the back side of the columns, and the bottom row teeth. And then when we get all the rest of the parts in, we'll work it all around. That grease will kind of get distributed where it needs to go. And then, on the flyback lever on the back side of that as well. That just grease will get distributed where it needs to go. And then we'll go back later and I'll use some Rodico and clean all the excess up. Where it'll look like there's not even any grease on there, but it'll just be a film on the contact points. You won't have all that extra laying around there. But this may seem a bit excessive, and it might be, probably compared to, some more seasoned folks. But it works great, and the action works great. And once you clean it up when you're done, the end result is the same. So I'm just kind of testing it and just making sure, feeling how all that's working right now. Without that operating lever spring on there, that lever doesn't, you got to reset it manually. There's the flyback lever, how that works. And you can see the intermediate flyback lever on top of it, how it engages with the column wheel. So that's all good. Now we can put on our ratchet wheel. This ratchet wheel has a square hole cut out into it. You need to index it properly on the arbor. And then I'm going to pull the click spring just barely out of the way, let it fall back into place and seat between two teeth. Now we can put this one screw on. And in order to get kind of tension on that screw, you need to keep the ratchet wheel held in place. So it kind of slipped on me when I attempted the first time. So I'm going to kind of reset my hold down tool here and try to hold it again. Keep it from turning. There we go. Got a little bit of bite to it, and that held in place. So I'm lubricating the points here for the first and second coupling levers. And I just kept working and didn't even pay attention that both my cameras died because I turned them on and off at about the same time. So I went ahead and I got that first coupling lever in, and just realized that my cameras were dead, so I put batteries in them, and that's going to happen one more time actually before this video's over. So my apologies. First coupling lever, second one was the one I put in off camera. The first one's in, and I'm turning that column wheel one slot to get the pillars on that column wheel in a place where that coupling lever can go in between them, and a little bit of grease here in between where those two make contact, and then up here on that first column wheel, or that first coupling lever where it's going to engage with the column wheel, just a little bit of grease there. So getting those two screws, that's the one for the first lever, and then that shouldered screw for that second lever, that holds down both levers. And then a little bit of HP 1300 on the upper side of that eccentric screw. That eccentric screw kind of, it makes very light adjustments, but that can change the geometry, the angles in which that hammer strikes the hour recording wheel and the minute recording wheel and the chronograph wheel. And that's actually out of whack. I've never actually, before this video, I've never once had to adjust one of those, because typically on all those, if you don't mess with it, you don't have to mess with it. But that one was, and I'll just kind of tell the story now while you see me kind of assembling the rest of this thing. I didn't really realize that it was, because it resets, but the reset was not consistent. So it only really caught it once I had the dial and hands on, and then they would reset to different positions. It wasn't consistent. Something was definitely off. So I went and tried to find some literature, some stuff on forums, or just something that talked about how to clearly set that, because on the other ones, it's very obvious. Like on the first two, we already discussed, where the right indexing point is, but I couldn't really find that info. So I spent the better part of an hour at my bench, making small adjustments, seeing what the results were, and then just kind of learning. And so by the time I had it dialed in, my cameras were off because I was trying to figure it out. So that's not in there. Just know I did adjust that just to get the reset where it needed to be. So here I'm putting some 9010 on the faces of that hammer. And ooh, I did a good job on that. I didn't have any spillage. See if we can go 2 for 2. Suspenseful. 2 for 2. Just saying. So on the second coupling lever, that is what engages with the intermediate stop lever, that big stud. And so those two need to make contact. And that's the last eccentric screw that I need to adjust. And I do show that and what you need to look for. We'll get into that here in a bit. Just lubricating and installing the minute recording wheel. This is the intermediate minute recording wheel. This can be kind of a pain sometimes to kind of get in there, but we do not lubricate that wheel at all. Lubrication actually becomes a hindrance on that. There's so little friction on that. Lubrication won't actually help you. So now we can go ahead and install our chronograph bridge. And I kind of fiddle with this thing a little bit. It's kind of there. It's kind of found its spot. That hammer click spring isn't really helping us right now, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast when you install those. So I'm getting all 3 of those, but we just made sure all the pivots were through their jewels and bearings or bushings before we, really tightened it, before we did anything, but all that looked good. So now we'll tighten those down fully. Just like that. So that's the jumper for the minute recording wheel. We'll set that into place. And now I can check in shake on the center chronograph wheel and make sure that bushing, the jewel that we adjusted on that chronograph bridge is where it needs to be, and it looked good. There's the end shake for the intermediate minute recording wheel. I'm going to check the minute recording wheel itself. Kind of a poor angle here, but you can see that got a little bit of end shake, and that seems to be fine. And then now we can lubricate center wheel, chronograph wheel, put some grease here for the hammer click spring on the hammer stud, and then I'm going to grease the face of this click spring as well. And if you find that it's really hard or it's too easy, either way, that the feel of that butt when you're pressing the reset, you can adjust. And I had to adjust that before everything was said and done. Actually, that spring was too tight. That reset was just way too tight, so I adjusted that out. Now we're going to take a look at the column lever. So right now I've got the coupling levers engaged with the chronograph wheel. And right now you can see with that in there, there should be a gap between that second coupling lever and that post for the intermediate stop lever. And when it's stopped, there should be a gap. They should not be touching according to the instructions. So I made about 3 or 4 adjustments. I'm going to show one here, just slight increments. And at the end in the stop position, that's the gap. And then I also made sure with that gap there, we still have even travel among those coupling levers in and out of the chronograph wheel. So they're clearing properly. And now we have that proper gap. So that looks good. And I'm going to throw a little bit of lubrication on that minute recording wheel. And here I'm checking the reset. This is after I adjusted that tension on that spring by pulling it back downwards from this view. And when you kind of bend it a little bit that way, it puts less tension on the hammer. And then it makes that button function properly, and it takes less force, but you still need some, but you kind of get the feel for it, but that's where you make that adjustment. Now we put in the pallet fork and the pallet fork bridge very carefully. I'm going to put this bridge on, get it lined up, and then I'm going to kind of play with that pallet fork and kind of get it in that upper jewel. There we go. It looked like it dropped in. And I'm just going to use tweezers to hold it down and move it around before we tighten it, just to make sure it's in there properly. Once it is, we can go ahead and tighten those things up. I'm going to put just a couple wines in here and check the action of this pallet fork. And you want to see it jump very vigorously, one side to the next. Boom, right there. See one more the other way. And that's looking really great. So now we need to lubricate our escapement. So that's some special grease for the escapement. We'll apply that to 5 teeth at a time, and I'll repeat that process 2 more times. But hopefully you guys like that view. I hope it turned out okay. Now we can put it on our balance. So you find the lower jewel pivot in there and make sure that's in there, and then just kind of rotate this around just slightly. And that one actually went in pretty nice, I must say. That one went in real nice. So now with that running, we can go ahead and get our 2 screws in there. Just pushing them all the way down at first, and then I'll go through and tighten them properly. That spring actually looks like it's breathing really beautifully. I'm really pleased with that. Looks real healthy at first. The balance is not shaking. It's not out of bounds. Just everything looked great. Eyeballing the amplitude. I mean, it wasn't terribly low. But now I want to take a look at this chronograph and just check the rollover of the minute recording wheel. So go ahead and engage it to where that chronograph wheel starts touching. Watch this. I'm going to point an arrow here to this teeth. That tooth should be in the middle of that viewable window, and you'll see the chronograph arm come around and push that tooth, and you want to check the end of it and make sure the boot of that chronograph wheel doesn't touch, and it doesn't. It barely clears. So we'll rotate this thing around a few times. So I've obviously got this sped up because every rotation of that wheel is 1 minute, give or take right now, because the watch isn't regulated. But you can see kind of that's how it works. And we'll slow it down one more time and watch this. Kick that tooth over and make sure it doesn't touch after it passes it completely. Right there. When it's working right, I mean, that the gap between those two is very tiny, but that is proper. So this is after running about 24 hours with that aftermarket mainspring. I'm really pleased with the numbers on this. Obviously, our escapement lubrication's on point. Good solid line. Not a lot of noise. Amplitude in the 220s. Give this watch about 2 weeks of running and use, and that amplitude is going to be in the mid to high 230s and maybe even 240. Really pleased with this, actually. After 24 hours, that lubrication's still not settled as well as it will be later. I mean, that amplitude is going to go up, but that's fantastic. Really, really pleased with that. So now we can install our calendar works. And as I do this, would like to, shameless plug, I suppose. If you do enjoy these videos, you like the content, you find them entertaining or informative. If you want to like the video, I sure would appreciate it. If you want to subscribe, I sure would appreciate it. This has been a really interesting journey. The channel's kind of grown more than I anticipated. I didn't actually know what to anticipate, but a lot of engagement and a really great people. And I'm enjoying talking with you. I tell you what, there's some things I didn't really anticipate. I've been actually just a little inside baseball here. I've been contacted by 2 different companies in separate instances. I'd get an email and say, their company, whatever, and they have whatever product they would like me to to use, well, hey, we'll send you a free whatever it is. And, if you'd make a review video of it. And I politely turned both of them down. And the reason being is twofold. One of them is like, I'm not a salesperson. Like I like to work on watches, but how do I make a product review video and me being in the video and talking about this and that? And here's the features, and you can do this and this and this. It's just, I don't think I'd be good at it. And especially if they want to send me a product to do that with. If I was doing that to someone, I would expect a certain level of quality that personally I don't think I would be able to achieve. Secondly, in both of the cases, they were different products. It's just something I don't use. While I could see how they would serve a purpose to watchmakers, I have a different way of doing what those tools and those things would have accomplished. And I told him, I was like, listen, I have nothing against your product. I'm sure it works great, but it's just not something I use. So I would not feel good. It feels almost kind of disingenuous to me sit there and do a review, even if I like the product, to say, hey, this is really great, but I don't use it. It seems kind of disingenuous. So I politely declined the request. I have nothing against the companies. I wish them nothing but success. But it's just things like that where I never thought for a million years that would happen. But, it kind of threw me for a loop when I got those videos. I'm like, oh man, this was a hobby, but then it started to become like more of a feeling like more than just a hobby when you start to get those kind of requests. But I will say, hey, Horatech or Bergeon, if y'all want to shoot me an email, I'd love to have a a few tools or, a Rober. They make these Rober crystal presses, super nice presses. The dies on those things are outside of my budget that I would allow myself to spend on one, but I'd love to have one. I'm like, hey, if y'all want to send me one of those, I will review the hell out of it. I'll figure it out. I'll get on camera, I'll sing and dance for you. But unless that happens, I don't really see myself doing much of that because this is just, like I said, weekend watch repair. It's just me kind of in spare time or whatever getting that done. So, well, that was long winded, but well, there we go. We got the calendar works together. I hope I didn't go over anything that you didn't catch, but just doing a test here just to make sure everything's working good, and seems to be. And I'll go ahead and clean up the day wheel and day and date wheels just to see if there's any little specks of anything that want to come up. They were, in pretty good shape, but there might be one or two specks of something that come up with that. So now we can put on our dial spacer and the dial itself. And this one here wanted to be just a hair stubborn at first. One of the dial feet was just maybe slightly off, but I just gently moved it around a little bit and then it dropped into place. And that dial really is pretty. And then now we'll go ahead and tighten down the two dial feet screws. That looks a lot easier than it really is trying to hold all that steady while under a camera lens, but got that done. And now I'm just going to take some very fresh Rodico and just go over that. I'm super high magnification on my microscope right now. And I'm just any speck of anything that I'm seeing, just trying to clean that up. So now it's time to put on the hands. And while I'm putting on the chronograph hands, that one, the minute recording wheel, and then the last one, I'm pressing in the reset as I'm doing it. And I do have a little bit of camera battery issues. So right there, that is the final shot when the battery died when I was pressing in the hour hand right there. So I went ahead and swapped out the battery. And what I didn't pay attention on, that battery was basically a dead battery. It had about 5 minutes of power in it. So I press on the minute hand. Then I go to put on the chronograph hand and pressing it in. And then right here, right there, still shot. That is the final frame before that thing died. So, if I didn't have bad luck, I'd have no luck at all, I suppose, but it's completely my own fault. So putting the case together, got that little inner trim ring in, and now I cleaned that Viton gasket in some IPA, and I'm just kind of pushing that into place. That is 100%. 52-year-old gasket is as good as any brand new gasket you're going to get, and it's going to last longer. Getting that into place, and now we have a brand new crystal. Pushing that into place, just making sure I'm not pinching, and it's sitting in that little ridge that's in that crystal gasket. And I'm going to try my hand at centering this bezel before we put the movement in. If it's off center, you can pop it out and then readjust it later. Sometimes I like to put it in after I get the movement in, but I'm just gonna put it in, get it as close as I can, see how lucky I get. And this one is not a rotating bezel, so it just, when it does go in, it's just gonna click. So I first turn, I didn't really hear anything. I turned it a few times. It actually clicked on the second one. Did one more for good measure, and now that's on. So we can go ahead and case this movement. We're getting to that point where I start to get excited. Go ahead and flip it over. Man, that's looking really good. So now I want to put a little silicone grease. I like to put silicone grease inside the crown tubes or the case tubes, and it just helps. I do grease the gaskets in there, but I like to put a little bit in each one, work it around, and it just kind of helps with everything. So I got brand new gaskets on both chrono pushers and on this crown stem, and I've put silicone grease on that on that tube. Not a giant amount, actually, just a very light film, because that what's inside the crown tube is going to help it out. So we'll put those in, and now we got replacement pushers, the correct factory Seiko pushers. Those are not aftermarket, although I mean the ones on my watch are aftermarket, but these are original Seiko parts. Brand new springs, brand new gaskets. And in order to put the movement ring in, you got to push both pushers in, and then we can install the movement ring. And I've already got the spring pre-installed on that, and that captures those pushers. So once that ring's in, then I can release those pushers, and it'll actually capture the feet on those. So now I'm going to go ahead and put together the automatic works for this watch. So we're just lubricating the bottom side of that transmission wheel and put that into place. Make sure that it's in its jewel hole. There we go. Now we have our cover plate that indexed on 2 different posts. And now we can go ahead and lubricate. We put some HP 1300 here. You can also use S4. I think the manual calls for S4. HP 1300 works really well too. You can, but you need to put a liberal amount on, not on the top of that post, but on the sides of that post, and then kind of out there a little bit where the back side of that paw lever is going to rotate around. And then we'll go ahead and put the paw lever in place. And that lubrication will actually hold that paw lever in place as we turn that part over to install it. So that's what's keeping that paw lever from falling off, is that lubrication we put on. So we'll put that into place, and then we need to move that paw lever to the outside of the transmission wheel. Just like that. The other side's on there, but that's what that little window is on that bridge, is in case you do need to adjust it, you can. But once everything's in place, we can go ahead and tighten down our final 2 screws. So just like everything else, I would put them down all the way, make sure the plate's flush, and then just torque them properly. Now we're putting a little bit of lubrication on just a couple of the ball bearings for the oscillating weight. And we also need to put some, actually I'm going to clean that up a little bit too. I made a little bit of a mess. But we need to put some on the upper jewel for the transmission wheel, as you see here, just a very light amount. And then on the transmission wheel itself, we'll just put a dab on each side of that, and then we'll work that wheel around, and that'll rotate that wheel around and distribute that lubrication across that and the paw lever teeth. And that's what I'm doing here, just kind of rotating that bearing around. And I'm watching that transmission wheel to make sure that regardless of which direction I turn the bearing, that transmission wheel rotates in the same direction. Now it's time to put on our oscillating weight. And so the mounting hole for that is directional. So it can actually go on one of 2 ways, 180 degrees off from one another. But we'll get that in and then just kind of brace the wheel while we tighten it down. And I'm just going to double check and make sure that there's no clearance issues. Actually had one of these a long time ago where the hammer spring had a bend in it, and the oscillating weight was catching it. So, but just making sure that nothing's catching, and that checking the play and the bearing and everything looked good. So we have a brand new and correct flat gasket for the case back, which you can see we've pre-lubricated with silicone grease. So we're putting that on and just making sure that it's flat all the way around before we install it. There we go. So we'll just gently put that on and get the threads started. Then I'll go through and use the ball and just kind of get it almost all the way down. Now we can take it over to the press and then torque it down properly. So we'll just use some plastic on the bottom side to make sure we don't put a mark on the crystal. Some on the top side of this case, and to go ahead and tighten this thing down properly. Darren, we've talked before. This is his watch, and he really likes that original case. And we've talked about a few things before, and this case, it doesn't look like someone's attempted to repolish it before. The edges are still. It's a very round case, so there's not really sharp edges to mess with, but it's an honest original condition case. So he wanted to leave it alone, so that's exactly what we're doing. I love it the way it looks. We're going to go ahead and test the reset now. This is after I've already adjusted the hammer spring or the hammer eccentric pin. So that reset looks really nice, and that is repeatable. I did it, 30 times just to make sure that everything was good. So I thought it'd be cool to have this shot here. There's his watch on the left, and I'm going to kind of bring in, this is my UFO on the right. And on a previous video, we talked about the differences between resist and proof, and the dates in which that all happened when they started removing the waterproof labeling on those. So on his dial, see where it says resist on that dial. His is October of 1971. On my watch, mine is May of 1970. And so between those times, they stopped saying proof on the dials and started saying resist. And so like my dial, you can see the lume on mine is basically shot. It got moisture in it at some point in its life. So that's why I'm so jealous of his dial. But since mine was an original proof dial, I left it alone. But this watch here is looking really great. He has a band for it, which, oh, by the way, I just thought this shot was so cool. You could see the minute hand moving and then the chronograph seconds hand going by. But he had a bracelet ready to go for it when I gave him his watch back. This picture's from the day he got his watch back, and this is about 6 hours later, and he's got it on with the new bracelet. And he's in his hunting blind. So I love it. I love he's wearing that watch. It looks great. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the video. I surely do appreciate it. If you like the channel, if you want to give us a like or a comment or a subscribe, I've got the 5,000 subscriber giveaway watch ready to work on. So as soon as we get there, we'll do that video. But until then, we'll see you on the next one. Take care.